Well, thank you very much, Rick. I hope everybody can hear me at that sort of level. Does that sound about right? I know you're going to have a little problem with the accent, because even after 25 years in the US, it has its English twang is still there. I'm actually not used to being in a halo of light. Halos, never mind. But it really is it's a delight and an honor for me to be back at the Minor Institute and having this invitation to start off this series, Rick. And I thank you, and I thank the Board of Trustees and all the staff. I spent a lot of years as chair of animal science, as Rick mentioned, and was often at Minor, but it's probably 10 years or something like that since I've been in Shazy, and I'm reminded of what a wonderful place this is, and how important it is for Shazy in New York, and frankly for agriculture in general. And I really applaud you starting this series, because these debates, these discussions about agriculture in society and the critical issues are so important. And I'm hoping that the inaugural lecture won't be the last one. As I started to put this together, as Rick said, I'm a microbiologist originally, but like many other researchers and scientists, as your career goes on, you increasingly start to get interested in other aspects, bigger picture perhaps than you originally started out. But as I put this together, I did begin to think that perhaps I should have stuck to the Petri dish. It might have been easier. Anyway, we have this simple topic that we're going to talk about, feeding the world in the 21st century. And my tendency as a speaker is to wander about. Today I'm trying to be a little bit more rooted for our television friends, but hopefully that won't lose too much of the dynamism. So today's discussion, there are three big chunks of what I'm really going to try and talk about today. I'm going to start to talk about the trends in food production and consumption, particularly in the USA, over about the last 100 years or so. What's happened and why has it happened? What have been the factors that have led to the changes that we've seen? And then I'm really going to move into a more sort of global setting of that. So use the US to sort of start this off, but then start to think more globally about that, and to also think about what are the challenges that we face at this point in time, and to then move to saying, well, are there some reasonable steps to be thinking about the way forward? So hopefully that will form a reasonable structure for you. And I'd start out by saying, I don't have all the answers. This has been an exploration for me in many ways, just as it's an exploration for all of us. And you find there are conflicting data. And I think one of the big messages for me in all of this is we need to have good, informed, open discussion about what the big issues are. And we need to get data, and we need to look at it, and we need to talk about it. And I think we'll see that as we go through. So let's talk about the last 100 years or so. And let's start off with the US population. So if we go back to about 1900 or thereabouts, 70 million in the US, something of that sort of number. 2000, that's approaching 300 million, around about 300 million. So we've seen a big growth in the US population over that 100 years or so. If you go back to 1900, and 1900, 35% or thereabouts of people were involved in agriculture. They were working in some form of agriculture, maybe not directly on the land. They might have been working in a milk plant or whatever, but they were associated with agriculture. As we come to today, that's a little bit under 2%. So we've seen a huge change over that time in the employment that has occurred in the agricultural industry. Not surprisingly, we've changed as a nation also in the fact that if you go back, this goes back to the 1800s, but the point is the same. At that point in time, most people were rural. Most people lived in rural communities. Today, of course, that's not the case in percentage terms. In fact, if you do the calculation for population growth, we still have about the same number of people are living in rural communities in a sense, but that growth in population has predominantly been in the cities and towns. And of course, it's not surprising because, as I've already showed you, employment in agriculture and on the land declined hugely over that 100 years. So people left the land to find jobs, and they left often small communities to find those jobs. This is data from 2006. And what it looks at for a number of countries around the globe, how much of household income as a percentage is spent on food. And this is the US here. And on average, in the US, about 5% of household income is spent on food. And that's very low. I jokingly say, and I'm not entirely joking, that it's almost getting to the point where people spend more on their cable bill than they do on food. But for many countries, of course, that's a very different set of circumstances. And it's not, of course, just what is the cost of food per se. It's related to whatever is household income. But it talks about affordability. So in general, food is affordable. That doesn't mean everybody has access to it, and I'll talk about that in a little while too. But if you look at China or Russia or India or a whole range of countries, people are spending 25, 30, 40% of their income on food. If you go in pretty much any supermarket in the United States, you see something that looks like this. And you see something that looks like this pretty much any month of the year you choose to go in there. So we have a wide diversity of food, fresh produce and of course meats and so on, available to us year round. And as I've already said, it's inexpensive. And in fact, I always say, if you look at in many ways, if you look in the supermarket, it's almost a geography lesson. As you go around, if you really knew where all of these foods are coming from. So of course, many do come from the US, but not all of them. Some come hundreds of miles, some come thousands of miles to be in that store. So, how did this all come about? What have been the things that have created these changes in availability, in cost, and also in employment that I indicated? I'm going to start, which, considering my background, won't surprise you very much, with science and technology. There has been what is often called a green revolution over that 100 years. And perhaps one of the most dominant elements in it has been genetics and breeding of improved varieties, both plants and animals, over that time course. So we can look at something like corn production and look at yield per acre, and fairly static here for 1875, 1925, 1950, and hybrid varieties, corn varieties, and so on. With corn probably having, I think you'd agree, Tom, as much genetic work on it as probably any other food plant. And you see huge increases in yield. Now, of course, that's not just genetics. It's genetics plus management and so on and so forth, and inputs and fertilizer. But varieties that have been developed that are highly productive in terms of the system they're in and in terms of yield per acre. Milk production. 5,000 pounds per cow used to be pretty much what it was for a long, long time. 5,000 pounds per cow today, you're going to go bust pretty quickly. So now it's much more like 25,000 pounds per cow. Again, feeding's a big part, management's a big part, but artificial insemination and selection and breeding also a big part. The industry's changed is what I'm trying to get at over that time course. Now, of course, when an industry changes, there's usually some other consequences of that. And I've tried to show those. This was US data. This is pretty much Vermont data. And if we start off with the bars, those are the number of Vermont dairy farms over, what was it, 64 or so to 2011. When I came to Vermont, and I don't think it was entirely due to me, some might disagree with it, there were around about 2,000 dairy cows, 2,000 dairy farms, a little bit more than that. Now we're below 1,000. If you look at the number of dairy cows, that's also declined. Herds have got fewer, herds have got larger, but there's fewer of them. And of course, the reason that the number of dairy cows declines, in part, is because of this. Because if you have a 4 or 5-fold increase in productivity and you don't have a 4 or 5-fold increase in consumption, guess what? Something goes wrong. And in the dairy industry, it's typically been milk price as what's gone wrong. So what I'm really trying to get at, these changes have occurred, but nearly all changes have consequences of some shape or form to go with them. We've reduced losses from pesticides and disease, antibiotics, vaccines, fertilizers, and so have increased yields, reduced losses. They've actually also allowed what I will call intensification of monocultural systems to develop in many ways. If you go back in those early days, farms were diverse in general. You know, they had pigs, they might have chickens, they might have cows, they had a variety of crops. That's not how it works anymore. So it's specialized and it's become focused in particular areas, and often, in a sense, I use the word monocultures and intensification. Mechanization, improved management methods. You know, we don't milk cows like this, although we do have robots doing it, kind of not that different to that anymore, but in a different setting. But we've mechanized these processes, we've reduced labor, we've reduced costs, and we've increased efficiency. The consequence, less people working on the land, and essentially a lower cost of production to the consumer. Irrigation. This is not Vermont. It could be Arizona. It isn't actually. It's actually in the Middle East. But did you know that 60% of the fresh water that's drawn globally is used for irrigation? So, and our agriculture, as I'll talk a little bit more in a while, is very dependent on irrigation. Not so much in the neck of the woods that we're in at the moment, but overall it is. It counters drought, and of course it allows crops to be produced in areas where they wouldn't normally be produced. And that also has consequences that we'll talk about in a minute. So I talked a little bit about this just to make the point. This change in intensification and structure, large operations, lower costs of production, this sort of vertical integration or industrialization as it's called, where you might have one company owning the breeding stock, somebody then taking that breeding stock and raising them, and then the same company is doing the processing, and the same company is actually doing the marketing. Those have been some of the changes that we see, particularly in business, in the industry of the poultry industry, and particularly in the pig industry. But you actually see that sort of consolidation has also occurred in the dairy industry. There are very, very many fewer co-ops around than there used to be. And, you know, they're both, if you like, producer and processor. There's a whole change in the structure that's gone on. And one of the consequences of this, of course, is these birds can be very, very efficient converters of feed into protein, or bird protein, for want of a better way of putting it. But those systems do rely on antibiotics and vaccines to work because of the intensity of the production method that's there. And there's also typically a little less genetic diversity, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment too. About 100 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago anyway, most of the food that we ate was produced locally. That isn't the case anymore. And of course, we've seen tremendous developments in terms of processing and packaging and transportation. And it's made a difference to year-round availability and shelf life and the sorts of products that are there. And it's changed consumption patterns. And it's also changed energy usage. But it's all been part of what we see in that store. Now, I want you to know there's a deliberate mistake. Actually, it isn't deliberate, but there is a mistake on this slide. Anybody tell me what it is? It wasn't Jimmy Buffett, right? It's Bobby McFerrin, sorry. I must have been in Margaritaville when I wrote it. So my point is, we got this cheap food, it's there year-round, so why worry, be happy? Well, I certainly don't want to underestimate the progress. I'm not trying to do that at all. But there are issues of concern, and I want to talk about a few of those. I already said agriculture is very water dependent. We know that the western part of the country has been going through unprecedented droughts in recent years, particularly in California, Texas, so on. We know that aquifers are actually depleting. We're taking more water out of those aquifers than is actually getting back into them. And you can only do that for so long. It's like anything else. And Wanda and I were talking about this a little earlier. There's very clear evidence that there are competing uses for water that are bringing tensions to the surface in a sense that they haven't done before. So as I said, if you look at water withdrawals, this is actually FAO data, so it's global data. 70% of the water that's used is used for agriculture. Now, of course, a lot of it gets back into the groundwater after it's been used, if you like, for irrigation. But industry 20% and municipal use 10%. Well, as you get into some of these communities in the US, this group in particular is starting to feel the pinch. And there will be a debate about, well, maybe the easiest thing to do is maybe we shouldn't give so much to agriculture. Well, there will be consequences of that. So, as I say, water is the next oil, or actually we're probably already there. We do have concerns, and to be fair, agriculture has by and large is recognizing these concerns and is actually seeking to make changes to address these concerns. But we do have concerns around erosion and topsoil loss. I saw some interesting data. If you think of Iowa as sort of being, in a sense, the heartland of the US agricultural world, 100 years ago, the average topsoil depth in Iowa was about 14 inches or something like that. Now it's 6. Well, our agriculture relies on topsoil. And so we need to worry about that. And people have recognized that a lot of the cultivation practices that we have used, of course it was a cause of the Dust Bowl in many ways, do create situations that lead to topsoil loss. And it is about thinking about no-till cultivation. It is about using organic fertilizers, manures, and so on. So there's a lot of elements in there, but it's a concern, as is water and soil contamination. If you live in this part of the world, as we do, we know that at some point in the summer there will be a discussion about algal blooms in Lake Champlain and the role of agriculture in causing them. And of course, we'll say, rightly, that it isn't just about agriculture, it's what people do on their lawns and so on and so forth, and that's correct. But we have a part of it, and we need to be doing what we can, as I know Ina is and others are, to address those sorts of issues, thinking about phosphorus and thinking about how we feed dairy cows and how we deal with runoff and so on. Deforestation. Large tracts of the Amazon in particular being destroyed on a daily basis. That's not an exaggeration. It's on a daily basis. And of course, it's being done in many ways to address some of the issues around food availability and farming that we'll talk about a little later. I put antibiotic resistance up there too. I mean, you could argue it from a human health problem as I would, but it's also an environmental issue that relates to probably too extensive a use of antibiotics in our agricultural system, in our animal agriculture, and frankly, too much free use of antibiotics in the doctor's office. It's not all one thing there either, but we'd better be thinking about it because we are moving to the state where we have strains of, for example, Staphylococcus aureus that we don't know how to treat. This is a great slide. It's now a few years old, but of course, for me, it seems like yesterday, but it is a few years old. And it was work that was done by Steinhardt, and they published it in Science in the 70s. And what it looks at is the energy inputs and outputs into agriculture. And what it shows us is that actually agriculture over that time was dramatically increasing the energy inputs into the system. But there isn't a commensurate output of increase in output. You know, you can measure calories, both ends of that. So what's happening, we're taking people off the land, right? And we're putting machines on the land. We're using diesel, we're using petroleum, we're using electricity, we're doing more processing, we're doing more packaging, we're doing more transporting, we're doing more refrigeration in the home and everywhere else, and that's what happens. That's not sustainable in the long term. So we have to be thinking about what that means for us. So we have about 5% of the world's population, and we consume around about 25% of the world's energy resources and about a third of all of its resources. Speaks for itself, I think. I talked about genetic diversity. This is probably, you probably can't read this at the back, right? So let me, what it tries to show you is that at the top part of this shows various seed varieties that were available in commercial seed stores or in commercial seed manufacturers and houses back in 1903. And this is where we are where we were 80 years later, 1980 or something around there. Okay? So I know you can't read them. So for example, in the 1900s, if you looked at sweet corn varieties, there were about 307 varieties of sweet corn available in the seed catalog. Right? Today, 12. Beet, 288, 17. Tomato, 408, 79. Why has that happened? Because some varieties do better in the systems that we're using. So they're the ones that people buy, and they're the ones that the seed companies propagate. Not rocket science. It's understandable as to why that happens. But of course, it also means that you've lost some traits over that time course. Ones that you're not selecting for, or ones that don't matter very much to you. But they might matter to us as we go forward. we might be much more interested in the drought tolerance. We might be much more interested in the ability of a plant to cope with salinity than we have been in the past, or even cold for that matter. We might be much more interested in genetic resistance to disease rather than relying on inputs of pesticides or whatever to control disease. So I think one of the concerns that many of us have is, for understandable reasons, we've tended to lose genetic diversity, and we may need that genetic diversity as we go forward. Does that make sense? So we have the cheapest food in the world. We have plenty of it. We're actually an exporting nation when it comes to food. So we must be the healthiest nation on the planet. Yeah? We're not, are we? We actually have significant chronic disease problems associated with our nutrition, one way or another. It might be obesity and things like type 2 diabetes, which are associated with it, or heart disease and so on and so forth. But pretty much, we eat too much and we're overweight. Some of us more than others, but we're... And of course, there's a whole bunch of factors. You can't blame agriculture for that. And I'm not doing so, you know. But if you look at it, there's a whole bunch of things that probably influenced it. We promote large portions, and we promote fast food, and we promote calories. We have much more sedentary lifestyles, despite all our efforts to run and go to the gym, or perhaps that's why, of course, we're doing those things, than we used to have. But frankly, commercial companies market salt and calories, and they know that in a sense they're addictive, and that we like those products and we'll buy them. We've also seen changes in family units and work patterns, many more single parents. Maybe having 2 jobs to keep everything together, you know, and how much time do you spend shopping and preparing food? There's been a whole bunch of things that have influenced this over the years. But despite everything, despite this abundance, many people in this nation are what's called food insecure. And it's a euphemism. It's a euphemism for being hungry or malnourished, but it sounds better. And it's defined as having a lack of access to sufficiently nutritionally adequate food. And it's usually poverty, and exacerbated by education or lack of it. And many people, it's a trade-off between what do I spend on food or housing or whatever, despite the fact that we have the cheapest food proportionately on the planet. So this is probably a measure of income inequality, really, more than it is anything else. But it's also a measure of educational inequality. So about 46 million people in the US, 16% of the population fit that USDA definition. 22% of them are children. Malnourished children is not a very good investment for the nation. I see another real concern around what I call public confidence in science, broadly speaking. It's difficult to open a newspaper or listen to maybe these days it can be difficult to actually find a newspaper, but the media does a lot of coverage of food and food safety and food scares and so on and so forth. As they should, in a sense. We all eat, so it's a matter of real interest to us. And it takes all sorts of forms. And I guess my concern, and it comes back to less of us are involved in the land, less of us are involved in agriculture. And frankly, as a nation, less of us are scientifically literate than we should be. But we're not always as well informed, and frankly, there are people who like to actually exploit that ignorance one way or another to their own ends. To some degrees, both ends of that spectrum. It's not just one side of the spectrum, but it happens. So And I'm not saying that there aren't concerns that are real. And for example, I spent a lot of my time at the Institute for Animal Health in the middle of mad cow disease and BSE in the UK. So I've had some first-hand experience of that. There are things that go wrong in the system that have dramatic effects, and we need to be worried about that. But that's not really very helpful, I don't think. You know, we get into debates about whether we should vaccinate our kids, and we've seen all the sorts of consequences of that. It's all about having rational, informed debate. And I would argue that the US food system is actually probably the safest it's ever been. I'm not saying it doesn't go wrong sometimes, and certainly intensification can mean the consequences of something going wrong can be much more widespread than they were in, if you like, in the old days. But to put some perspective on it, I want to make sure I get to the right numbers. But foodborne illness kills about 3,000 people in the US annually. Firearms, 30,000. Drunken driving, 13,000. Diabetes, 70,000. And smoking, 440,000. 100 years ago, none of us were around, but people died of typhoid, people died of cholera, people died of TB, and they were associated with contaminated food and water very often. So we've seen huge progress. And I guess my real concern is that as we go forward, we need to be able to certainly address real issues and have real discussions about what are the consequences of not pasteurizing milk. And is there a rational basis to stop pasteurizing milk? And what would be the consequences of that? But let's have that debate informed by real data and not emotion. And I put these up, I couldn't resist it. So on the left hand it says, the scientific method. Here are the facts, what conclusions can we draw from them? And on the right hand side it says the creationist method. Here's the conclusion, what facts can we find to support them? Frankly, not just in science, but in politics and a whole bunch of other ways, we do too much of this and not enough of that. So let's move from domestic to a more global setup. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the future challenges that we're going to see. Population growth, climate change. I'm going to talk a little about geopolitics, and then I'm going to get to finish up with some thoughts about what might be important ways forward. Estimates of global population, you've already seen these. I don't need to spend much time on them, but most of them predict that we will end up with 9 to 10 billion people on the planet by 2050. Most of that growth, of course, occurs in the so-called developing countries rather than in industrialized countries. And there is debate. Some will argue that that means that food demand will increase by 70%. Others will argue we've got plenty of food, it's just a distribution issue. That's what I'm talking about. When you start off with, you'll find there's conflicting perspectives. And the folks who say we have plenty of enough will turn around and say, well, look, we're doing all of it. We grow all these crops. We make biofuel out of them. We put most of them into animals to make meat, and we could do it differently. The ones who say that food demand is likely to increase by 70% are aware of the fact that the developing world is desperately trying to increase the amount of milk and meat that it consumes, and that US has not been very good at going to vegetarian diets. Population growth, interestingly, and you may be aware of this, but I think it's worth emphasizing, it's not really about birth rate. It's not that the developing countries have much higher birth rates than we do. In fact, most of the developing countries have declining birth rates. And in fact, the average is only about 2.5 children per female, which is not very much. The normal replacement rate is argued to be about 2.2. In several countries, Thailand, for example, has lower birth rates than the US. What's actually caused this is infant mortality has been falling. And it's hard to argue that infant mortality is a good thing. So as children have lived, rather than dying of preventable diseases in childhood, guess what? They become adults and they have children. And that's what tends to create it does create that population growth. People will say that today we're at peak child. There are 2 billion children alive today. And that actually, of course, they are the parents of those young adults for 2050, but there's a good thing in this, that because of this, many demographers will argue that actually that 9 billion or whatever we get to at 2050 will actually be a peak. And because birth rate's falling, and because education's improving, because childhood mortality is falling, because economic well-being in many parts of the world is improving, those are the things that influence birth rate. And so that may be a peak, and so we may see us actually stabilizing or declining after that point. Climate change, you know I can't go through this without mentioning climate change. We all know the Earth goes through natural cycles of heating and cooling. Human activity, we know, increases CO2, other gases like methane and so on. I don't mean just humans increase methane, but human activity can increase methane. Like dairy cows are good producers of methane. And we know that we're currently in a warming cycle. And the concern about the greenhouse gases, as you probably all know, is that what happens, the sun's energy, the sun's heat comes into the Earth's atmosphere, but generally at night it escapes. And what happens with the greenhouse gases is they end up with more of that heat being trapped and less able to escape back out into space, so we get warmer. And you've all seen lots of the examples of the effects, like, sea level will rise, storms, droughts, forest fires. But I put this one up because I just thought this was pretty dramatic. This is Glacier Bay in Alaska. This is the glacier in August 1941, and that's the same view in August 2004. It is changing. And, if we lose the ice caps, then we see 4 or 5 foot increases in sea level, and that means large parts of the world like Bangladesh and Vietnam and many other parts of the world, and Florida, by the way. Anybody? I thought Arizona was probably safer from that perspective. But it's real. At least it's real that we've got some challenges there that we're going to have to face. And I think the important thing, and this gets to where I want to really sort of end this up, is that we're going to see a time of the geopolitics, for want of a better way, of scarcity. That's what's going to happen globally. We're going to see limited food, limited water, limited land, limited energy. And the consequences, obviously, people chop down trees and they start farming. Bad thing to do from a climate change perspective. We need those forests. Famine, disease, social unrest, political instability, war. These are all potential problems that will arise, which frankly won't stay neatly compartmentalized if these start to happen in the world. We will be affected just as we are by terrorism. And an affordable food supply is pretty much an essential for civilization and for political stability. A major driver of the Arab Spring was rapidly increasing food prices. Of course, there was issues of inequality and so on and so forth, but food price was one of the things that got people onto the streets and reacting. French Revolution, Russian Revolution, again, yeah, lots of social inequality, but famine was the cause of both of them, really. And this one aided by the Russian Revolution, aided by the First World War. And I just noticed this. Did you know, Ukraine, of course, has been in the news for a variety of reasons. Did you know that China has leased 5% of Ukraine's land to grow food for the next 50 years? where do you think that food's going to go? Ukraine? No. China has also bought Smithfield Foods in the US. China knows that it's got a major population problem, and it knows it's going to have a food and energy problem. And frankly, they are going around the world making steps to address that now. That's what that's about. They're very much involved in Africa because they're trying to get natural resources to make sure they have the adequate natural resources. They're doing irrigation and dam problems in Nepal and Tibet and parts of Asia. Why? Because they're worried about water. So where do we see the global insecurity? And essentially, it's where you would expect. And then this red is high risk, then it goes to orange, then it goes to yellow. It doesn't show the difference, but this is sort of, this pale yellow here is the lowest risk of food security. And so the problem's really most of Africa, a significant part of Asia, and it's really predominantly the US, Western Europe, Australasia, and some parts of South America have relatively low risk of food insecurity. But it is a global problem as we look ahead. So here's the big question. Can we do it? Can we feed 9 to 10 billion people by 2050? Can we do it without destroying the planet and its resources, without widespread poverty and economic collapse or constant conflict and so on? And of course, I could stop here and say, I have no idea. And neither does anybody else. But I wanted to pick up on a report which was commissioned by the UK government, excuse me 1 minute, to look at these global food system pressures and start to think about, well, are the steps that we should be taking in terms of policy, not just the UK, but are the steps that we as the, if you like, as the developed world ought to be thinking about and taking to address some of these concerns. And they actually identified 12 priorities, and I'm going to go through those. First one, an important recommendation, I think, is apply what we know that's good about sustainable, effective, efficient production. And the estimates are you could actually increase food production in Africa and 2 to 3-fold by doing so. And it's about making extension and advisory programs that are more effective. It's about often strengthening rights to land and natural resources. And it's also about building human and social capital. But let's not forget, don't reinvent the wheel. We know quite a lot that can be used to help countries establish greater sustainable food production as we go forward. We're going to have to invest in new knowledge. And I think the nature of what we need to be investing in is different. It's less about how do we make things grow faster, bigger, quicker, whatever. It's much more about how do we counter climate change, how do we reduce inputs of energy and fertilizer and nutrients and so on and pesticides, and how do we protect the environment. So that's where, I think some of those genetic traits that we were talking about earlier are going to be important. There are genes around that will help us think about resistance to drought or flooding or salinity or disease, which may allow plants to be less dependent on external inputs or may take up nutrients more effectively. Maybe they can even fix nitrogen, not just the legumes and so on. We can reduce greenhouse gases because agriculture is a major generator of greenhouse gases. And we can do some things about renewable energy sources. I'd say we don't use corn, we start to think about things like algae, which may be very good ways of producing renewable energy sources. But we have to do that. And a concern, and I want to read this from Norman Borlaug, who really, for many of us, was one of the geniuses of the Green Revolution, a plant breeder he's a Nobel Prize winner, he's got a presidential medal and so on. And he said, I now say that the world has the technology either available or well advanced in the research pipeline to feed on a sustainable basis a population of 10 billion people. The more pertinent question today is whether farmers and ranchers will be permitted to use this new technology. While the affluent nations can certainly adopt ultra-conservative, low-risk positions and pay more for food produced by the so-called organic methods, he's not a great enthusiast about organic methods. And I'm not talking the rights or wrongs of that. But as he makes the point, the 1 billion chronically undernourished people of the low-income food deficit nations are not going to have that choice. So we have to avoid getting into camps and saying, I know the way, follow me, or don't follow them, it's wrong. We need all the knowledge, all the smarts that we've got to solve some of these challenges as we go forward. I said there's debate about how much land do we actually need on how much additional food do we need, and then how much land will we need therefore to produce it. But I was quite struck by some of the arguments that were put in this paper, and I've got, by the way, a handout for anybody who wants it that's got some of the sources that I've used for this that you may want to just explore at your own time and read and enjoy. We use about 40% of the global land mass for agriculture. Of the other 60%, some of it's too high, some of it's too dry, some of it's too cold, some of it's too wet, some of it's covered with concrete, but the basic argument that's being put in this study, this UK study, is that we probably don't have the option of dramatically increasing the land base that we use for agriculture because of the availability and because of competing uses, and the fact that if we suddenly start to say, okay, well, there's all of the Amazon, let's cut the trees down and do it there. The consequences on climate change and global warming will be significant because trees are pretty important for us in terms of fixing CO2. We also need to maintain natural habitat for a whole variety of reasons. We need wetlands. We need all of these sorts of areas that we've protected. They're there for reasons, and so we have some limitations. So Mark Linus at the Oxford Farming Conference said, we're going to have to feed these people with the same land area we use today, but with limited fertilizer, water, and pesticides in the context of a rapidly changing climate. So there's some challenges there. It's important to us to play our role in this, not in the sense that we should solve the world's problems as a food exporter. We have some role to play there. But because it's in our interest for these other nations to develop sustainable food security for themselves. That's in our self-interest, and it's in a global peace and security interest. And we have a lot to contribute to that, I believe. So yes, it's not just we'll ship corn, we may do that, but it's really also about intellectual resources and education. Two ways, because we don't always have the right model to apply to somebody else. We can learn from them as much as they can learn from us in some of these other countries. And for our own folks too, as much as anybody else, we need to understand and respond to what are going to be the effects of climate change on our food system as we go forward. Water use I've touched upon. It really is going to need some global agreements, because the trouble with rivers is they don't always stop at countries' borders. They may start here and end up here, and you will get into competing issues around water availability. So it's going to need a lot of global cooperation and discussion. And if I look at the US Congress, I'm not very confident that we can do that in the US, let alone that we can do it globally. But we have to be more efficient in our water use. A good thing, in a sense, ironically, is that we actually waste 30% of the food that we produce. We tend to waste it differently depending on whether you're in a developed country or developing country. For us, most of it gets wasted at the table one way or another, or in our refrigerators and gets chucked out. If you're in the developing countries, more of it gets lost in the field or on the way to the consumer rather than at the other end of that. So that's a generalization, but there's a difference. But the important thing is that irrespective of how much food that we need, we really have a great potential to improve food security by reducing the wastage one way or another. And some of the things are actually relatively straightforward to do. This one I don't think is very straightforward to do. And I'm not picking on this guy. One way or another, I think we are going to see some changing patterns of consumption. Clearly, as you go up, if you like, from a vegetarian diet to an animal protein diet, there's a huge difference in the resources that are necessary to produce a pound of beef versus a pound of corn, in terms of energy, in terms of water. We probably eat too much as a nation, as I've said. We probably eat too much meat as a nation. So we could have meatless Mondays and all the other things that have been talked about, and they would be good things for us to do. But by and large, much as I like to believe that humans are altruistic, I don't see a lot of sign of that happening at the moment. But of course, it might become necessary one way or another. It might be that as energy becomes limited or water becomes limited, the price of meat goes sky high, relatively, to produce it, and so it affects our ability to purchase it. You might find that regulatory approaches start to put taxes on certain things because of their environmental impact or their cost and so on and so forth. But I think that this is one of the things that's talked about a lot, but I actually think it's probably changing human behavior is usually not a very easy thing to do. But as I said before, 5% of the population, 25% of the resources. So there are other recommendations in the report. I think it's worthwhile you pulling it off the web and having a look at it. I think it's got things, I don't agree with all of it, neither will you, but I think it's interesting. And I was pleased at least that there was an attempt to say, okay, what are these issues and what do they mean for us? There's a lot in there about fish stocks. Fish, of course, we don't tend to think of very much because of where we are and what we do, if you like, but hugely important worldwide. And we overfish, and we have real problems in terms of policing fish stocks worldwide. And we have, that should say aquaculture, I apologize for that. Aquaculture has potential, but it's also had a pretty checkered environmental footprint, for want of a better way of putting it. A lot of argument that we should include environment, I would say also some social economic aspects in economic analyses. In other words, when you look at whether a practice is a good one or a bad one or the way to go, let's look at all the costs that are involved in it, because often some of those costs are externalities and they get picked up by the public purse. They may be in the form of subsidies, of water or energy or whatever, but they're still costs and they should still be looked at in terms of the analysis. I've already said that evidence-based decisions seem to me to be a reasonable thing for us to be thinking about, and that means we have to have ways of looking at data and presenting data that allow others to use it and understand it. It actually speaks for minor institutes and research universities and so on playing an important role in this going forward. And I think they also make the point that you can't do this top down. You know, it's got to be, we've all got to be engaged and understand the issues and think about the issues. And that's what I hope some of this has done for you today. I haven't had all the answers. All I've really tried to do is to go through this area and say, this is some of the stuff that occurs to me as we think about these issues and as we go forward. So my closing comment is, you can read it, As a species, we've transformed the world in both good ways and bad. We now face a huge challenge which will require us to integrate what we have learned about food production and develop new knowledge to maintain productivity, but to do so sustainably and with less external inputs. We must also change our lifestyle and expectations to meet the new global realities and resource allocation. And this will require unprecedented international political cooperation and leadership. And hopefully, it's not really the end. But I will stop there, Rick. And I think you guys want...
Okay, go ahead.
The thing that dawns on me is that the word leadership up there, we have so few of it, truly. It would seem that your presentation should be given in front of the UN, so that they can actually, people who are making decisions on a worldwide basis can begin to get true facts and a balanced outlook on it and some impetus to begin to do something and not do something.
Well, I couldn't agree, I don't agree with me standing in front of the UN bit, but I agree with the rest of your sentiment. And I think it's going to require huge global participation and cooperation and leadership to address this. And at some point, I guess that you tend to believe that when the challenge becomes great enough, that starts to happen. But my fear is that it'll be almost too late to do it by then. So I'm not phlegmatic about that, and I probably intimated that as I went through. But and I think that this nation has a lot to benefit from and a lot to contribute into that sort of a dialogue. And I think that if we want to start about, I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to, as usual. If we want to really start to think about what U.S. foreign policy should be about, this is something that U.S. foreign policy should be about.
Question? All right. I'm told also that you need to stand up, and I need to stand out of the way of you in the camera, so smile while I got
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Bramley, to follow up on that last statement, since the United States is an exporter at this point in time, what kind of opportunities are there, both in terms of economics and societal and political, that we should be trying to get our leaders to pay attention to?
Karen, you're absolutely right. The U.S. is a food exporter, and the U.S. has actually been a major contributor in a very positive sense to a whole series of famine challenges around the globe over many years. So at some level we can be proud of what the U.S. has done in that regard, and I think there will be opportunities for that in the future. There's a sort of subtext in here for me is, depending on what happens around energy and depending on what happens around water, we may not be an exporter at the level we are now in the future. For example, if you look at the fruit and vegetable nuts that are consumed, the U.S. supply of those, I think nearly 50% of them come out of California. California is going to have some real problems if this drought continues. The Colorado River has got less flow. Lake Mead levels are dropping. So that could have a dramatic impact on our ability to do what we do. I think it could influence some of our internal policies. Because, for example, we do, and some people argue it's a crazy policy, the way that we're, for example, producing ethanol out of corn. So we might start to change some of those things in a global setting like this and say, there might be more effective ways of getting renewable energy than doing it that way and using that land base to do it. But then I think the other opportunity is we do have the best university system in the world. And I have I can say that, I think, with some confidence. It creaks and groans, and it's not all that it might be, but it's still pretty good. And we have bright people who, by and large, care and want to do good things. And so I think a large part of what we can export is that. And, of course, we can help it tremendously in terms of education of folks in many of these countries in terms of agriculture and food systems. I don't mean that we have all the answers, but I mean we can help train people to think, to analyze data, and to address problems. And I think that might be the most powerful export that we're going to have going forward.
Come around, pardon me. This is where it gets to be.
Dr. Bramley, there's an anti-science mood in the country, and we sometimes blame the public for that, but universities have developed deeper and deeper into smaller and smaller issues, and meanwhile the great public issues you're talking about, the land-grant universities are largely silent on. And what can we do about that?
Good question.
It's a great question, Joe. I think it is absolutely a responsibility of land-grant universities to lead and not follow in some of these issues. And I think there has become an unfortunate political climate in which universities are anxious about sticking their head above the parapet and getting political criticism because they think it's going to affect funding, or maybe they know it's going to affect funding. So, you know, and if that really continues, then that will destroy the credibility of public, not just public, but let's say particularly land-grant public universities. Because they were created, I mean, Justin Morrow created that whole idea to have independent education and subsequently experiment stations and extension system to be the arbiters of independent information that was of value to the public. And frankly, when we see things like GMO labeling bills, for the sake of argument, I think it's important for land-grant universities to be involved in talking about that issue, and I know that my colleague, the Dean of Agriculture here, is involved in doing that. And I think there are efforts to not because, you know, you can argue it's fine to label something. You know, how can you argue against honest labeling? But that's not really what it's about. And we all know that. It's really about, we don't want this technology, so we're going to do it. Well, we may damn well need this technology. So I think that we've got to, as a nation, invest in public universities, in research and independent research, so that nobody can say, oh, well, it's Monsanto's data, what would you expect? It's not. It's independent data that can be looked at and examined and assessed. And I think that one of my real concerns, and it comes back to the really your first point there, we need to be able to stand up and speak out for what we believe in. And I think that what, Rick, in a sense, what you're trying to do with this whole series is to engage the public in some of those debates, and I think that's a tremendously important thing to do.
Okay. There's a couple. Shall I go with the dean first, or the person who raised their hand first? Okay.
Yeah, make the dean wait.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Bramley. So as you talk a lot about developing our interests globally, getting the other countries on their feet and their production efficiency up, how do we start bridging the gap between our private interests and our domestic markets? So, you know, we have a lot of private sectors that have a lot of interest in these countries, a lot of control over their political systems. So how do we start bridging this gap between our domestic markets and the international markets?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and it's a tough one, you know, to resolve. And I think part of it is alluded to a little bit in a couple of those points that are in that report, which talk about bottom up rather than top down, and about community education and empowerment and so on and so forth. You know, I'm not a believer that, you know, agribusiness by definition is bad. I think agribusiness generally seeks to support, you know, to create profits for its shareholders, and that's what business does. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it looks at the world in the ways that I look at the world, and that's okay, but we need to be aware of what the different motivations of groups are. And I think it's one of the strengths that's occurring here is around local food becomes one of the mechanisms that does that. That people start to get much more interested in where does their food come from, how is it produced, what does that really mean? I don't mean in terms of the silly labels around that, but really meaningful things. What does that mean? What do food miles mean? What is the carbon footprint of this? That's how we start to change this, because in the end, if it becomes issues of sustainability hit the pockets of business, business starts to change. Supermarkets start to change, because in the end, they know that they have to have customers. And if their customers want something and speak for it loudly enough, they'll respond to it, because that's what the system does. So I think a lot of it's about dialogue, education, honesty, openness, and to some extent regulation.
At the beginning of your presentation, you showed a graph showing a shift from rural population to urban populations. And I know that in part of the discussions with the Farm Bill, there was concern about how it had to be food stamps and farm subsidies had to be combined, because there was a risk that urban communities wouldn't care about rural communities and vice versa. Does that, I don't know what the shift is worldwide, but is that divide between urban and rural communities create a severe problem with creating good agriculture and food policies?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I'm certainly not an expert to answer it, but I'm glad you raised it. And I was, Janet and I spent some time back in India, September, right? September, October. You know, and there are times when you're in India, if you sort of want to get a sense of what does 10 billion people look like, there are times in India you think you may know what 10 billion people looks like. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, it's just the scale of cities in India and the number of people, you start to see some of those things. But we also were fortunate to spend a lot of time in a couple of rural communities, which was actually, for me, was one of the real high spots of the thing, in small villages. And one of the things that really struck me in that, and I think it's relevant to your point, there's actually a difference between urban poverty and rural poverty. And in rural poverty, there was still community. There was a sense of community in a village and so on. And I think that very often in an urban setting that starts to get lost. And I think in the end, things like thinking about food and those who are not getting enough of it requires a sense of community. So I think that's, if you see where I'm going, I think that's what starts to get lost in a more urban setting. Less, if you like, empathy and understanding for one's fellow members of that community, because the community's something you can't grasp in the same sort of way. So I think as this change has gone on, you know, and you see more of the political power gets associated essentially with urban or city, yeah, the rural communities do start to lose out in that. And I think that's another challenge in this whole debate going forward.
Dean Vogelman first, and you're next.
Well, thank you. In all honesty, I was hoping to masquerade as a returning student or a gentleman farmer, so you guys blew my cover. But I have an observation and then a challenge. And the observation is that agriculture in this country has been really successful in terms of mass production. To spend some 4 or 5% of our income on food, it's got to be a historic low anywhere in the history of the human race. And so when you go to Washington, D.C. and try to make a case for increased funding for agriculture, they look at us like we're stark raving mad, and maybe we are. But at the same time, we have, I would say, a lack of public trust in the land grant system. The states are cutting back funding. And at the same time, you've got a lot of very dedicated faculty at the land grant system. We're a scrappy and dedicated bunch. And so, John, if you were czar of the land grant system.
You saw the Russian Revolution. That didn't work out too well. I don't want to be the czar.
And if you had 5 things to focus on, and that includes the faculty here at the Minor Institute, 5 things to really sort of spend our energy on to get over the next 10 years so that we can break out of this national complacency, what would you suggest we work on?
Thank you. Well, one of them is what you're doing and what Rick's doing, and that is don't think that education stops at the classroom door, because it doesn't. Because there's a huge responsibility of the land grant institutions for public education writ large. So I think a big piece of in the end, you're talking about how do you create political change is really what you're talking about. And in the end, politicians are influenced by what you think? Votes. And so I think the more education we can do to the public, generally the better. I think that we should be starting to think right now about what are the likely implications for some of these global effects that are coming, and some of them are probably already here. So I would say, as a plant scientist, where do we go when we're going to run out? What's going to happen when we don't have any phosphorus to apply, right? Or if we don't want to apply the amount of phosphorus we're doing, what are we going to do? How does that system work? How are we going to make sure that we can cope with less water or more salinity? You know, so I think some of the research agenda has to start to change in that sense. And I think that a lot of different parts of the land grant system are being differently placed to take parts of that. I think the next thing that starts to happen is that I think you should be using the limited funds institutionally that are available to make sure that we build collaborative approaches within institutions of scientists from different backgrounds and different disciplines to look at big questions, not little questions. And that's why I think the UVM initiative on food systems is really important. And frankly, it needs support from deans and it needs support from presidents. And it frankly needs support from legislatures and it needs support from all sorts of people, but it's important. And I think that we need to make sure that we are hiring faculty and rewarding faculty in terms of progress through the system for wanting to do the difficult big things and not just rewarding them and saying, okay, well, look, if you want to get tenure, for God's sake, don't work on that. You'll never get tenure if you do that. Choose this nice little thing here. You know, so I think the system has to change. And I think the last thing I would say is we need to remind faculty why they have tenure. They don't have tenure to give them a right for a job forever. They have tenure so that they can express their true knowledge and opinions without fear of being fired for them. That's what tenure is about. And if ever there was a case of things that we ought to be talking about, it's some of these things. I lost count.
That's 6.
Oh.
Good answer. I've got to stand on this side of you so I don't block your camera angle.
My question really refers back to the question earlier about the recent Farm Bill. We saw such a discussion about the separating of the SNAP program from other agricultural. Would you speak to that and give us, based on what I've heard here today, I would sense that separating them has more of a deleterious effect than keeping them together.
My personal opinion is that it shouldn't have a farm bill, right? Or at least we shouldn't call it a farm bill, because that's its origin. And of course, I'm as passionate and supportive of farms as anybody else in the room, I hope. But it really needs to be, the Farm Bill has got taken over by, again, by narrow interests. And it's about, oh my God, we've got to make sure this subsidy is still in there, or we've got to make sure this subsidy is in there, or we don't want to have too much of this. You know, and then you get big versus little arguments. And I think that what we really need, is that we need a national approach on a whole range of issues, one of which is food and sustainability and food security. I mean, I'd rather see it as the food security bill, if you like, and maybe that's not the right name. And I would rather see us really start to address issues around nutrition and food stamps and SNAP program in a comprehensive look at health, because that's really what it comes down to. And then if I was trying to do something else, I might think we could have an energy policy. Wouldn't be a bad idea. So, you know, and I think, and I'm not knocking people, you know, Pat Leahy and you know, has worked his socks off on the Farm Bill for years, and so has Peter Welch, and you know, and so on. But somehow it's become a frustration, and it's lost its real goal. And I think that if you really start to look at this big picture, you start to identify things that we need to be talking about in terms of national policy, which never seem to get even to first base from a Farm Bill perspective. And that's, you know, one of the reasons why those folks are talking about externalities, you know, and economic analyses. We need to look at some of those big picture things. But here as a nation, we've produced the cheapest food, as we said, or Rick said just now correctly. We've done this. It's a tremendous achievement for agriculture. You said it. I apologize. But we still have a lot of people who are malnourished or certainly not well fed and are not healthy. And that, to me, is one of the things that need to be policy issues. And so food stamps becomes part of that, but it's a bigger question than that. And I think the trouble is that if it's in the Farm Bill, it gets lost in all of the other stuff. And so maybe if we could really take some of these things and establish some national priorities, we might do better.
All right. Go ahead, Barry.
Thanks. Dr. Bramley, I think you mentioned several times about the importance of a
You mean ad nauseam, sorry.
a bottom-up approach, that public education is terribly important, public awareness of some of these issues. And I guess I might broaden and see if you would agree that while the land-grant and grant institutions are terribly important, don't you think that the process of public education and public awareness really begins so much earlier in our system, and our public seems to lack a sophistication in terms of how to be critical about the information that they're given in the media, and fail to discriminate when there is a biased selling point or some other reason to be pushing in one direction or another. And so really what it seems to me we could use that would help so many other things besides feeding the planet is a more sophisticated approach, starting with the science education of our children in how they digest, how they critically view facts that are presented to them.
I totally agree. I think that's right. I mean, I answered the question because it was phrased around land grants, but absolutely, it's, you know, in a sense that we've really got to start from preschool. I mean, it's really where you've got to be starting, you know, and that, and we've got to look at a much more integrated approach to the whole thing, and we've got to recognize that the way that most of us, there's some nice young folks in the room, so I shouldn't generalize too much, but the way most of us were taught is not the way young people learn today. And so we need to have to change that, you know, and that, you know, I don't see anything wrong with folks getting most of their information online, as long as it's accurate, right? And then using the human interaction to discuss and debate that. I think that's a much more effective way to use resources than to listen to some old geezer like me talking. And I think it's critically important to get very young kids learning what the scientific method is. In other words, carrying out experiments and saying, oh my God, that's kind of cool. I wonder why that happens. And they say, wonder what happened if I did this. If we did that, we no longer lead as an educational nation. We did, but we're not now. But I think we could again. So I couldn't agree with you more. The sad thing to me is I talk to people, I think most of us get this, you know? I don't think that legislators get it very well, and I don't think Congress gets it, but I think most of us get it. Why is that?
Dr. Bramley, you've used the word sustainable in talking about sustainable agriculture. And I know, you know, for me, my definition of sustainable is different than when I go across the lake to Vermont, to my home. And it seems like there's, how we use that term gets kind of, I guess I'd like to have your definition of what is sustainable agriculture.
Well, I guess I use that word probably slightly differently to the way that some would use it. And I agree that becomes a challenge, you know, because typically it's been sort of used as being a mix of being, you know, economic and socially acceptable and so on and so forth. For me, I think of a sustainable from an agricultural, I think of it really in terms of inputs and outputs in a sense. And to me, it's sustainable. If you're constantly taking water out of the well and it's not refilling, it ain't sustainable. So I'm using it much more from a resource perspective when I think about those things. Now, that's not to say that it's sustainable if it has terrible negative social consequences. So you've got to have those other pieces in there, but I tend to be using it as I look at the global issues and I start to talk about energy and I start to think about water. Those become the focus much more for my sustainability than perhaps some of the other ways it gets talked about. I should have asked you what your definition is, really. I was tempted. Is your definition different on this side of the lake, you say?
I'm going to sneak behind you.
Pretty much the same on both sides.
That doesn't surprise me.
Okay. It's okay for the same person to ask more than one question, right?
If it's as thoughtful as the first one.
Go ahead.
I was on a business trip in central Ohio a number of years ago, and I had a sustainability issue there. I was seeing bulldozers taking up prime Ohio soil so that a parking lot could be made. And, you know, the more we pave things, the less soil we have. And, you know, we've got problems out in California with the weather and the water. Ohio doesn't. You know, even New York has got more rain than most places. And yet, here we do this, and there are no laws to regulate that, and we keep plowing up beautiful farmland for all kinds of, the developers really are running the show, and it's not good for us. There needs to be some priority changes, maybe through government.
How much trouble shall I really get in today? I agree. Of course, we're going to need that, because what's going to happen is we're going to suddenly realize that we don't have enough water to make milk in California the way we're doing it now, and to grow the forages to do it. It won't work in the long term. And I've always said that will be the resurgence of the dairy industry in the middle and the eastern part of the country, whether it's Wisconsin or it's Ohio or it's the Northeast. Of course, I said that in 1992, and it hasn't happened yet. So, but I think that, it's kind of that topsoil argument that I was raising, that once you put concrete over it, then you're probably never going back. And I think it would be a very sound policy as we face these challenges to think about protecting prime agricultural land. Now, if you want to run for office and start off by talking about zoning, then good luck. Unfortunately, I'm not going to run for office. But that's really what you're talking about, is saying that you can't do this with this land. Now, it comes back also to almost to a cultural issue, because, and I think it might have been Joe and I were talking about it earlier. I mean, in Europe, that's fairly widely accepted, So in Britain, for example, you have areas that are called green belt. You can't build in them. They're there to protect those areas. And in a sense, yeah, it's an invasion of individual property rights, if you look at it from that perspective, for the greater good. And perhaps Europe seems to do a better job of doing that than we do. But I think it's, I don't think we can afford in this whole argument to lose too much prime agricultural land. And we've lost quite a lot.
Well, there's another question over here.
Oh, God.
At some point, just out of respect to our speaker, we may have to cut this off. This is fantastic, though. Go ahead.
I was at a talk this past semester, and it was about Great Lakes sustainability, like the fresh water that's the Great Lakes hold and how much fresh water there is. And the main point made was that people not wanting to change their way of lives, we're going to do more of a mass migration to areas like the Great Lakes that had a lot of fresh water. Should we be more so focused on funding projects that account for this new migration, or should we be funding more projects that are fixing the areas that are already having issues?
That's an interesting point, and I guess my immediate, and I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, so I'm glad you raised it. I mean, I guess my immediate reaction is we have to do both. And I think that if we do start to see a population shift towards the freshwater areas, for want of a better way of putting it, then we've got to make absolutely sure that we're planning ahead in terms of preserving the very thing that people are moving towards, for want of a better way of putting it. And I think it still remains, and to be fair, I think there's been a lot of work around the Champlain coalition between New York and Quebec and Vermont to do some of those things, to protect that asset. And there's certainly a lot happening in the Great Lakes. But they are going to be, if there's a major population shift, then it is going to put a lot of pressure on those resources. I mean, you can't stop people doing that, if you like, but you're probably going to have plenty of tax dollars to pay for some of the potential consequences.
So you've talked about the strength of our university system in the U.S. and the research that we can do and what we should be focusing on. and how we can redirect the way that we educate our young people. But there is already that gap that exists between the science illiterate and the researchers per se. So how do you suggest, or do you have a suggestion for how to bridge that gap that already exists and to get the information that we have and the information we'll find out to those who maybe have already been through their education system but didn't seek a university education and maybe don't have access to the information that the rest of us do?
You know, I'm not sure that I have good answers other than the sort of fairly obvious ones, you know, and I think that public television is one of the important things that we can do. I think, you know, OSHA lifelong learning institutes are important things to talk about some of these, you know, and it's great to go and learn conversational Spanish or whatever it is, but it's also important to talk about some of these issues. So I think that you're absolutely right in that we've got, you know, a current population that we need to engage in this. And I think that, to me, one of the great sadnesses is that the media is so narrowly focused, you know, about stuff that really doesn't matter. And it would be nice, because it sells advertising copy or whatever, I understand why. But I think there's a public responsibility to have some of these debates and use various sorts of ways to get that information out. So I don't have good answers other than that, but I think you're absolutely right to raise that gap. It's there. You know, I think the saving grace too might be there's a lot of boomers out there who are sort of getting to that point where they have more time to start to think about these, and they can get engaged and get educated and talk to people and start to become effective community advocates. Then that might be another powerful tool. I don't know. Good question.
You've alluded to the fact earlier that there seems to be sort of a divide between what we may call the sustainable local organic food producers, the new entrants to the ag operations, and the conventional producers. And I'm wondering how you think we can get the two sides talking rather than, as you said, staking out positions and screaming at each other across the aisle.
Because it's really terribly unproductive for everybody concerned. You know, and I think this has been something, and I would want to give credit for people like Chuck Ross and the, you know, Secretary of Agriculture in Vermont, who's tried very hard to avoid, you know, saying, you know, compartmentalizing this. There was I'll give an example, perhaps I'll call upon the Dean to give an example of the discussion you were in earlier this week. Was it this week? Last week. Yeah. Talk a little bit about that, if you could. Sure. Because I think it's an important example that dialogue can occur and occur in useful ways.
Yeah, well, two things that I've seen over the last couple of years that give me hope that there can be a dialogue. One is the Farm Foundation met locally last year before, and they had people who practice conventional agriculture, and they had some organic folks in the room. Of course, they sat at different sides of the room.
But it was the same room.
But it was a fascinating dialogue because what came out of it was the organic folks were willing to listen to the conventional folks, and they said, you know, you guys think in one way. You think about spraying and fertilizing. And I really thought about that because it's sort of one way of thinking. And I thought, yeah, the organic guys are always trying these different approaches and a lot of creativity in their approaches. So I'm sort of hoping now that there'll be some transfer of knowledge. But at the same time, there has to be an acceptance by the other side of modern genetics. We're not going to go forward without genetics. So the conversation needs to continue. And last week I was part of a panel in Vermont sponsored by the Intervale and City Market. And these are primarily folks who are interested in organic produce. And there was a representative from NOFA Vermont on the panel. There was a representative from Extension and myself. And you know, you go into these things with a lot of fear and trepidation because you just don't know what they're going to throw at you. And yet, it was a very thoughtful conversation. The audience was there to listen and learn. And I thought, my goodness, it's about time. So it gives me hope that there will be a way forward.
You know, I think one that, as you just picking up from there, because I think it's one of the important points that you made there. It's, you know, it's a two-way street, the communication here. You know, and that's why the dialogue actually is so important for both groups. I don't like putting them as groups, but you know what I'm getting at. That I think that there's a lot to be gained there, because frankly, you know, on the conventional side, we are going to have to use less pesticides and less energy and less inputs. There's not much doubt about that. It's pretty obvious that's what's going to have to happen. And the organic folks have got a lot to contribute to that because they've been doing it. So you're absolutely right there. But I do think the key thing is to me, one of the absolutely critical ways to address some of these concerns around inputs, for want of a better way of putting it, is going to be genetics. And to turn around and say, oh my God, we're not going to do that, is just crazy. Sorry, I kept you waiting. I apologize.
Thank you, Dr. Bramley, for your presentation. I wanted to follow up on this gentleman's original question. I have a feeling I may be the last person asking a question, so I think this is appropriate. You referred to the United Nations and wondered why they haven't really been looking at this issue, but in fact, the United Nations and numerous international organizations have considered all of these issues in exhaustive detail and published some very informative and I would say alarming reports covering these issues. Virtually all of those reports point to the significant benefits that would be realized by transitioning to a plant-based diet. And I know that, you know, you alluded to it briefly before, and you said, you know, you didn't think there was much hope that people would actually be adopting plant-based diets. I think it is a slow evolution in thinking, and I'm imagine that, you know, as a resident of the North Country, I know where I live, and I don't, you know, in my community, for example, I may be the only person who has adopted a plant-based diet, but I would urge you, if you're interested in these issues, to take a look, for starters, at the FAO report, Livestock's Long Shadow, that was published in 2007. It's a hefty read, but it's well worth it.
Thank you. Oh, I mean, I don't. You know that I don't question for a minute the argument that says that we use a lot more resources to produce meat for our consumption than we do to produce plants. And of course, a lot of the plants that we produce, we don't use for human consumption, we give them to animals. You know, so there's some real issues there. I guess I think the more that we can do to make people realize, you know, I don't think many people are going to adopt a totally vegetarian diet, you know, if you look at the mass. But I think many people will start to think about vegetarian food in their diet, for want of a better way of putting it. And I made a sort of analogy to the meatless Mondays. I think that's the way to do it. I can tell you, when Janet and I were in India for 3 or 4 weeks, India have a pretty vegetarian diet. It's varied, it's fun, and it was tremendously enjoyable. So part of it is an educational process and an opportunity process. And if you make people to realize that there are options out there, and those options are not only flavorful and attractive, but actually help save the planet, then that probably is a good way forward.
Well, hopefully I can redeem my generation's expertise, but had some good questions. I guess sort of following up on your comment and all of this, I wonder what the percentage, and I'm sure you don't know off the top of your head, maybe you do, but livestock eat a lot of food that's not fit for human consumption in the first place. And I'm not saying that I disagree with your comment. I think that, you know, a lot of the world doesn't eat as much meat as Americans do, but
Although most of them would like to eat more than they do.
right. Is
It
there an
becomes the other challenge.
opportunity for sustainability to incorporate livestock consuming things that we can't eat in the first place because we can't digest it nutritionally? Do you know what? And
Yeah, I think, yeah. That's, I think, why cows eating grass is actually quite a good system. I think cows eating corn is probably not quite such a good system from that perspective. But I bow to our nutritionist.
Yeah. This isn't about us tonight. Any other questions?
Right.
No? Well, this has been fantastic. I had no idea the questions would go this long. I think that just shows what an important topic it is. Please join me one final time in thanking Dr. Bramley for sharing with us tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic.